This weekend I was in Van Buren, Arkansas. Had 15 to 20 atheists, humanists, free thinkers show up, and ended up staying Friday night until about 10:45 talking with them. I told them when we got to some question and answer part of the seminar, I said, look, I'll stay here as long as you guys want to. They could not believe that I had a problem with their morals. In fact, one of them, she said, she looked at me, we were kind of gathered around in a group, she said, so do you think that we're bad or we're immoral? And I said, wait a second, time out, you don't get to use that word. She kind of looked at me funny. She said, what do you mean? I said, in order for something to be good or bad, it demands a standard that's absolute. You don't have that. I said, I can use it because I have a standard called God. You don't believe in God. So you're not allowed to use good or bad. Well, that really just set her off. She couldn't imagine why I would say that. I said, okay, what is your standard? She said, we believe everybody ought to be able to come up with their own moral code. To which I literally stepped back and said, okay, now you're scaring me. Because think about that for just a moment, folks. If everybody in the world got to discern what is right in their own eyes, that's a messed up society. Now, having said that, think about this for just a moment. How do we teach morals and character without God? And as you're thinking about that, consider we've actually removed him from the classroom, right? It's interesting to me, Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of our Declaration of Independence, he realized you can't have education without religion. You know, we constantly hear separation of church and state. Listen to what he said. The only foundation for a useful education in a republic is to be laid in religion. Without this, there can be no virtue. And without virtue, there can be no liberty. Liberty is the object and the life of all Republican governments. He said, without religion, I believe learning does much mischief to the morals and the principles of mankind. And he's right. I'm going to prove that to you this evening, but I want to kind of set the stage. We've talked a little bit about the evolutionary theory. This evening, I want to begin by talking about why does it even matter? And in order to do that, we're going to take a little bit of a history lesson. Now, I'll tell you right up front, I could go way, way back on my timeline. I could start back in, for instance, 1859. A guy named Charles Darwin, he wrote a book called The Origin of Species, but I don't think any of you guys were living in 1859. Okay, maybe one of you. Just kidding. We could go back to, say, 1925. Scopes trial, Dayton, Tennessee. Some of you remember studying that. But again, that's really too far back. What I want to do is I want this history lesson to be very personal tonight. In other words, I want to talk about what has happened during your life. Basically, what's happened on our watch. So we're going to start about 1950. 1950 is when our government got involved in the topic of man's origins. They formed the National Science Foundation. Those of you who were living at the time, you may remember we were racing the Russians to space. Remember that? Well, in 1957, we got beat by Sputnik. The Russians launched a satellite. All of a sudden, there was a lot of fear, a lot of panic. Everybody wanted to know, what does this mean? And there was a massive amount of pressure to have better scientists. We felt like we were getting beat even in the educational level. Take a look at this quote. It says, the tide began to turn in the 1960s in part because of the Soviet launch of the Sputnik satellite in 1957. That triumph of Soviet science created a national panic over the state of American science education, including the teaching of evolution. Textbooks began surveying evolution again, and by 1967, even the Tennessee legislature had repealed the law that had gotten Scopes arrested. Lots of pressure, everything's starting to change. Well, just 2 years later, in 1959, the 100th anniversary of Darwin's book, President Eisenhower's advisors came to him and they said, look, if we're going to do this, what we've got to do is we've got to scrap the way we're teaching science. We've got to use what everybody else is using. We got to go with evolution. And so, 1959, Eisenhower asked Congress for $1 billion to revamp the way we teach origins. Now, $1 billion, that's a whole lot of money. But $1 billion in 1959, that was an enormous amount of money. And he got it. And let me show you the dominoes starting to fall right after that particular decision. Again, that was in 1959. By 1962, Supreme Court said praying in school, it's outlawed. It's unconstitutional. The very next year, some of you may remember this name, Madalyn Murray O'Hair. She won her famous lawsuit, kicking Bible reading out of the classroom. So follow me for just a moment. At the same time we're injecting a godless theory into the textbooks, we're also systematically taking God out of the classroom. In fact, by 1968, the state of Arkansas was told, you must teach human evolution. You don't really have a choice. The following year, 1969, our Congress passed the no-fault divorce law. No-fault divorce, what does that mean? No-fault divorce. Prior to that, believe it or not, it was actually hard in the United States to get a divorce. Most young people don't realize that. In fact, in almost every state of the union, it took a year before you could get a divorce, and it had to be one of the 3 A's. Abuse, abandonment, or adultery. Those were the only 3. When they passed this thing, quite literally, you could now get a divorce for anything. Somebody burns a toast, you get a divorce. You say, okay, Brad, why would you add that particular dot on your historical timeline? I'll tell you why. Because if you really want to destroy a nation, you don't start at the top. You start in the home. And folks, this right here, quite literally, was the undermining of the foundation of the home. I tell young people all the time, and I'm not really kidding, you realize it is now easier in most states to get out of your marriage than it is a cell phone contract. Think about that. Now, you look at me and you say, okay, Brad, I hear what you're saying, but what does it matter? Here's why it matters. What you believe about your origins dictates your behavior. Now, I am going to prove it to you, but again, I want you to remember what is the only legal theory of origins we're teaching in the textbooks today. And as you think about that, listen to the words of Abraham Lincoln. He said, the philosophy in the classroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next. The reason that I'm showing you that quote, folks, we've now had 2 generations go through our education system learning this godless theory. And they're now in D.C. Oh, by the way, that particular quote sounds an awful lot like somebody else. Adolf Hitler, who made the statement, he said, let me control the textbooks and I will control the state. If you don't remember anything else, please remember this tonight. Our children are the ultimate prize. He recognized, he knew if he was going to build a new world order, the way he had to do it was infecting the hearts and the minds of the young people. And as such, he was pretty successful. Which, by the way, may be why last year Melissa Harris Perry made the comment. She said, kids belong to the community, not their parents. Okay, folks, last time I checked, my children are my responsibility. And it's my responsibility to get them to heaven, not the communities. So let's do this. Let's look at the results of this failed experiment. I mentioned that it was during the lifetime of some of you in here. We're going to use 1963 as kind of our landmark year. And here's why. You remember Eisenhower asked for the money in 1959. Normally takes about 4 years, once you've made the request for money, that much money, to actually get it into the textbooks. And by 1963, we'd outlawed prayer and we'd outlawed Bible reading. Did we get evolution into the textbooks? Oh, yeah, in a huge way. But folks, what we started reaping were fruits that we weren't really even expecting. Like, for instance, the percentage of teenage girls having premarital sex has gone up in every age category since 1963. In fact, I want everybody in here to look at this orange bar that I put right in kind of in the middle of the graph there. That's representing 1963. Prior to that, over here, we were still telling people, hey, there is a God, you're created by God. After that, you're just the fortunate mistake of countless biochemical morons. You just came from some Big Bang explosion. Now, as a symptom of this one, sexually transmitted diseases in children, notice this, ages 10 to 14, up 385% since 1963. Birth rates for unwed girls, ages 15 to 19, up 200% since 1963. You notice it's basically flat, and then all of a sudden it does what? It takes off. Ironically, pregnancies are actually up 553% in that same period. You say, whoa, time out, Brad. Hold on, man. Your math isn't jiving. How could pregnancies be up 553%, but birth rates are only up 200? Well, that would be because in 1973, our nation passed something called Roe v. Wade, right? Legalizing abortion, which now means a pregnancy does not equate what? A birth. How about this one? Out-of-wedlock births, as a percentage of all births, has gone up every single year since 1963. In fact, I'm going to update my graph for you. As of December the 31st, 2013, 43% of all children born into this country are born in this situation. And you look at me and you say, yeah, okay, Brad, you know, we all know folks who meet that category. But what's the big deal? Okay, let me share with you what the big deal is. Number one, God had a plan for the family unit. Amen? Number two, you ever looked at what actually happens when you take a dad out of the home? Folks, look at the screen behind me. 63% of the young people who take their lives, they're coming from homes without a father. 71% of high school dropouts coming from homes without a dad. 85% of the young people who are in prison right now as I'm talking to you, guess what? Coming from homes without a father. How about this one? Unmarried couples living together is up 725% since 1963. Now, some of you are looking at me thinking, wait a second, time out, Brad. You know, the population's grown. Which is why I've got this white line right across the bottom. That's where we should be if we just go by population growth alone. We are quite literally off the chart. Divorce up since 1963. That's not a big surprise. You pass the no-fault divorce law, guess what? You're going to open the floodgates. And somebody says, wait, time out, Brad. It looks like it's getting better right there at the end. Your graph is going down. Okay, before you get out the banners and start celebrating, you might want to know the only reason why the divorce rate is going down is because our kids aren't getting married. They're just living together. How about this one? Violent crime in the United States of America is up 995% since 1963. By the way, hopefully you've noticed in all of these graphs, I'm giving you a reference. I'm not just grabbing numbers out of thin air, folks. The ironic thing to me is most of the references I'm giving you are coming from the same government that is demanding that we teach this godless theory. And yet they don't see it. In fact, let me show you kind of how bad it really is. grabbed this out of the LA Times. It says in most of Oakland Unified School District's 92 schools, the fight against crime and violence is unending. An Uzi, semi-automatic rifle with 15 hollow point bullets was among the weapons confiscated by district officials within the last year. Franklin Elementary School, trying to ensure the students know to hit the ground when bullets fly, they carry out shooting drills twice a year. Shooting drills. All right, let me make sure you guys understand something. I'm the product of public schools in Nashville, okay? I can remember things like fire drills. Loved them. Because you got to go outside, right? Single file line, everybody marching. I remember tornado drills. I was born at the end of the what do we call it? Cold War era. Very end, by the way. And I remember at least once or twice crawling under a desk. You guys remember that for bomb drills? Like that little bitty metal desk would do anything if a bomb went on. I don't remember this right here. Or how about this one? Suicide among young people since 1963 has increased 253%. Gone from the 12th leading cause of death, it's now the 3rd. And yet, folks, listen to me. Nobody in this room really ought to be surprised. Because if you take away God, ultimately, what are you taking away? Their hope. Child abuse, up 2,300% since 1963. Again, not a surprise. You tell people they're animals, guess what they act like? Illegal drug use, up 6,000%. In fact, let me give you our real report card. This is what the mainstream media refuses to talk about. And that is, since 1963, since we've removed God from the classroom and we've injected a godless theory, the United States of America has become the world leader in violent crime, divorce rate, teenage pregnancy, illegal drug use, and we got the highest illiteracy rate of any industrial nation. Now, let me point out to you, that's not my opinion. That's the facts. In fact, let me just show you a graph going the other direction. That would be our SAT scores. And you'll notice, starting the year of 1963, they had an 18-year straight decline. Now, I realize right about now there's some people in their 30s and 40s going, hey, wait, man, when I took it, it kind of bounced back. Okay, before you get all excited thinking your test score brought it back up, you might want to know those little bumps at the end there. Those are what we call calibrations. You know what a calibration is? It's where we make the test easier. And yet, even that's not working. Let me give it to you this way. Best way for me to really help you understand why does any of this matter? Envision in your mind going back to 1960. Okay, some of you guys were around in 1960. Let's say we walk down a school hallway in Paducah. We go down the hallway. We open up a classroom door. We ask a teacher one single question. What's your biggest complaint? Well, what is your biggest problem? They actually did this survey. You can find it online. Take a look at the top 2 answers. Talking and chewing gum. Now, let's fast forward to the year 2014 in Paducah, Kentucky. And let's do the same thing. First thing, you got to realize you don't just walk into high schools anymore, right? You got to get a visitor pass. You may even have to go through like metal detectors. But let's say we get in. And we go down the hallway, we stick our head in, and we ask the teacher that same question. What is your biggest complaint? Or what's your biggest problem? Is there anybody in this room that honestly thinks talking and chewing gum are going to be the top 2? No. They've done this survey several times since 1960. Take a look. You got all kinds of crime. You got violent acts. Now, please don't miss this point. You take a 15-year-old child from today, and you take a 15-year-old child from 1960, anatomically speaking, they're exactly the same, right? They're both 15-year-old kids. So how is it we've gone from talking and chewing gum to all kinds of violent crime, to drug use? It's what we're putting in right up here. And it's our attitude towards God. Think about it, folks. If your moral compass does not have a true north, then how do you know what is good and what is bad? You don't. And so, as you think about that, consider for just a moment what our kids are really getting. You know, we've touched on just a little bit here, but the reality is, I don't have a problem at all with our kids going to school and learning true science. And by true science, I mean this. Science that is not a fabrication, science that is not basically an embellishment to support this theory. Because consider for just a moment, true science points to who? God. Our nation's kind of made it out to be science versus the Bible. Now, God's the author of science. Just this very week, the Pope of the Catholic Church comes out and says, you know what? There's really no conflict between God and science. He could have used a Big Bang. Okay, the only problem with that is it doesn't fit this book. It's like, sure, Pope, you can say that if you want to throw the rest of this out. But the Bible says the earth was started, you had water first, then land, right? It actually says that plants were here on day 3 before the stars. So let me ask you, Pope, how are you going to get around that? He's not. What he's doing is he's kowtowing to basically all of the pressure they're getting. So when you think about your kids' textbooks, is there anybody in this room that thinks that textbooks ought to be able to deliberately lie to students for any reason? Hopefully not. I mean, it's written literally in our education codes. I basically could show you every single state code, education code. Wisconsin says, look, textbooks have to be factually accurate. California, factually accurate, incorporate principles of instructive, reflective, current, and confirmed research. Alabama says they got to be adequate. It's got to be current. Every state is saying the same thing. It's got to be true. It can't be. And yet, you open up the textbooks, evolution is a fact, not a theory. Wait a second. I thought we just said in order to present this to our kids, it can't be a lie. Folks, evolution is not a fact. It's a really bad theory. In fact, let me share with you just how bad it really is. On the screen behind me, there are 2 moths resting on tree trunks. This is an icon in textbooks today. They're called peppered moths. Basically, the story goes like this. Prior to the industrial age, there were 95% of these light-colored guys that you can barely see. There was only 5% of the dark because they said, hey, birds could spot the dark ones. They'd eat them off the tree. Then the industrial age happened. Soot and ash settled onto the trees became darker, and the population shifted. So now we got 95% dark, 5% light. They call this evolution in action. In fact, you go to museums today, guess what you're going to see? You're going to see exhibits like this, basically trying to say, hey, this is one of the ways we know evolution is true. Here's the problem with it. Problem number 1 is, in over 40 years of research, they realized those moths don't rest on tree trunks. You say, wait, time out, Brad. You just showed us moths on tree trunks. Yeah, those are dead. They've been pinned or glued. I mean, think about it for just a minute. When a moth lands, does he spread his wings out? Those are faked pictures. Number 2, these moths do not have a tendency to choose a matching background. In other words, they don't fly around going, you know, I'm a light-colored moth. I'd really like to land on a light-colored wall. Number 3, the guy who did the original research, his last name was Kettlewell. Nobody has been able to replicate his findings. You know what we call that in science? rubbish. And yet, you're thinking, well, surely they're still not putting it in textbooks, right? Oh, yeah, we are. Even though the pictures are staged, nobody's been able to replicate it. Why would they do that? Let's ask a textbook writer. We asked Bob Ritter, Canadian textbook writer, why do you do this? Listen to what he said. You have to look at the audience. How convoluted do you want to make it for a first-time learner? He said the advantage of this example of natural selection is that it's extremely visual. He said we want to get across the idea of selective adaptation. Later on, they, talking about high school students, can look at the work critically. In other words, later on they can decide if it's true or not, but it sells the picture we want it to sell. So let's look at a couple of these evolutionary hoaxes. Most of you are probably familiar with this one. Again, staple in the textbooks. These pictures of embryos. Now, I'm going to start at the lower left-hand corner right here, where you've got a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, pig, a couple of mammals, and finally a human. And you'll notice it's at 3 different growth states, embryological growth states. If you look across that top row, they basically all look the same. And the reason they all look the same is because the guy who drew these, he bought into evolution. He believed we all came from a common ancestor. His name was Ernst Haeckel. Said his changing in his thinking was when he read Charles Darwin's book. In fact, those of you who know your history, you know he actually visited Charles Darwin at his home there on the Mount. They shared their ideas. Lo and behold, guess what? A couple of years later, we get this. They say, so what? What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is this guy right here was convicted of scientific fraud. He was fired from the University of Jena. I even have a copy of his confession where he basically confesses and then says, well, but it's not a big deal because everybody in science does it. And you say, so what, bro? What's the big deal? He was convicted of scientific fraud in the 1800s, and yet we're still using his pictures today. Oh, we've colorized them. We've made them pretty. But folks, if you want to see the real McCoy, take a look at the bottom row. You got Ernst Haeckel's pictures across the top that he completely made up to support the idea of a common ancestor. And then you've got the real McCoys at the bottom. And yet they keep putting them in our kids' textbooks. Evolutionist by the name of Stephen Jay Gould, a couple of years back, he wrote an article in Natural History magazine where he was actually reprimanding evolutionists. He was saying, why are we still using this stuff? The article was titled Atrocious. Take a look at what he said. We should therefore not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered the 19th century textbooks. But we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not majority, of modern textbooks. Astonished and ashamed? Yeah, we're still using them. Or how about this one? Horse evolution. The idea that we started out with this little bitty guy right down here at the bottom, and over 50+ million years, we evolved up into modern day horse. At least that's what the textbooks want us to believe. It's interesting to me. If you look at those pictures, here's basically what they're saying. Given enough time, you can increase body size over time. In fact, that's what these graphs right here say. You've got body size increasing with time. Okay, let's stop for just a minute. And let's just use this thing that God gave us. If that is true, why do we have anything? I mean, if evolution causes something to get bigger, why don't we have like 6-foot mice? Or why aren't humans about 12 feet tall by now? If stuff gets bigger over time, which is what they're saying, by the way, how do you do that over time? How do you go from this creature right here that will only breed with itself and get something totally different? You can't. In fact, if I were to give you, say, 6 dogs, all different breeds, could you mate the dogs and get different varieties of dogs? Yeah, absolutely. And could you continue to mate the dogs and get like short hair, long hair? Yeah. But after, say, 100 years, you mate the dogs, what are you still going to get? A dog. You're not going to get a fern or a rhinoceros. You get a dog. Now, I know we got some students in here, so I want to make sure they hear me on this. Microevolution is true. Okay, microevolution is the idea that, yes, you can have small changes within limited parameters. Again, you look at dogs, you look at pea plants, but when you mate 2 dogs, you still get a dog, right? That's microevolution. The problem is they're wanting you to believe that, you know what, we can take a seed from a tomato plant, put it in an airtight container, put it up in your closet for 50 years. Okay, don't touch it. Get it out 50 years later, plant it in the ground. What are you going to get? Don't say tomato, because evolution's got to be true. So surely that's going to be like a cucumber or a palm tree or something, right? No, it's just going to give you a tomato plant. Listen to what one evolutionist had to say regarding this idea of horse evolution. He said, the family tree of the horse is beautiful and continuous only in what? The textbooks. He said, in the reality provided by the results of research, it is put together from 3 parts, of which only the last can be described as including horses. He said that all the way back in 1954, and yet we're still putting it in the textbooks today. In fact, George Gaylord Simpson, he said this. He said, the uniform continuous transformation of Hyracotherium, that little bitty creature, into Equus, or modern horse, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. And yet, again, your child goes off to college, takes General Biology 101 in his freshman year, they're going to see the horse picture. Or, how about this one? Vestigial structures. Big funny looking word. We don't use this word a whole lot. Basically, this is the idea that you've got leftovers in your body. Leftovers from your evolutionary past. At least that's what we're telling kids. You see, this particular textbook page says, vestigial structures are remnants of an organism's evolutionary past. You say, okay, Brad, what's a vestigial structure? Well, they would say your appendix, your thymus, your little toe. Although if you don't think you need your little toe, try cutting it off and walking around. You'd be surprised how often you use it for balance. I remember when I was probably about 10, I remember the rumor going around that humans were losing our little toe. And like within a generation or 2, it'd be gone. Here's the crazy thing. I've got 4 kids. Guess what they all have? 1931. Supposedly, humans had 180 of these things that we didn't need. 1931. Thankfully, today, that list has completely been eradicated. Because now we know what all of these things do. Let me give you kind of a walkthrough of history just to show you what I'm talking about. Again, it's an icon. It's in almost every single one of the biology textbooks to support evolution. This is 1989. Again, saying vestigial structures used for evolution. You'll notice they're talking primarily about the appendix. We move to 1994. 1994, they actually have a picture, human appendix, horse appendix, with the idea that basically this is vestigial. That's 1994. We move even further in time, 1998, to Growler's Encyclopedia, where they finally admit, long regarded as a vestigial organ with no function in the human body, the appendix is now thought to be one of the sites where immune responses are initiated. Its removal increases a person's susceptibility to leukemia, Hodgkin's disease, cancer of the colon, and cancer of the ovaries. Oh, wait, you mean it has a function? Yeah. It's interesting. When I was a kid, you get strep throat 3 or 4 times in a row. You know what they do? Take out your tonsils. They aren't as quick to do that anymore. Now, they will in certain cases. But they realize that's the primary immune site of your pharynx. And so they're not as quick to. Used to be, anytime they did surgery in the abdomen, you know what they'd automatically take out? Your appendix. They're not as quick to do that anymore because we realize it does have a function. In fact, take a look, R.L. Song, he put it this way. He said, not too long ago, man was imputed to have 180 vestiges. Organs like the appendix, tonsils, the thymus, the pineal gland, thyroid gland, they were all on the list. He said, today, all former vestigial organs are known to have some function during the life of the individual. He said, if the organ has any function at any time, it cannot be called rudimentary or vestigial. He said, as man's knowledge has increased, the list of vestigial organs decreased. So what really was vestigial? Was it not man's rudimentary knowledge of the intricacies of the body? In other words, just because we don't know what something does, doesn't mean it's an evolutionary byproduct, folks. I'll give you a good example of why deep down they don't believe this. I was doing a debate in New Zealand. It was one of my first debates, televised 3-hour debate. In fact, I'll give you guys the longer version. The guy that I was debating, his name was Dr. Joe. He was a surgeon. Before the cameras ever started rolling, I thought, you know what? I may be the only Christian this guy ever meets. I want to give him a good impression. So I went over, I introduced myself, shook his hand. I said, tell me a little bit about yourself. Okay. Those of you who've been to New Zealand, you know they do speak English, right? But it's British down under England, okay? It is not the southern twang that I'm used to hearing. So I heard him say, my name is Dr. Joe. I'm a surgeon. I practice homeopathy. I'm an atheist and a terrorist. And I thought, this is going to be a really short debate because I ain't sticking around. But I'd been taught good listening skills. So what did I do? I repeated it back to him to make sure I heard him correctly. I said, okay, your name is Dr. Joe. You're a surgeon. You practice homeopathy. You're an atheist and a terrorist. Well, as soon as I said terrorist, man, everybody started laughing. One of them came over and he whispered in my ear. He said Taoist, not terrorist. Taoist. I was like, ooh, sorry about that. I just offended my buddy here. So we start the debate. We go back and forth. Everything's kind of moving along. Well, I planned from the beginning to kind of set him up. So I did. Where did the verse come from? He kind of hung his head down. He said, well, we don't know that. I said, no problem, no worries. How about this? Could you tell them how we got the first living cell? He kind of shook his head. He said, well, we don't know that either. I said, no worries. How about this? Could you tell me, science says everything is going towards disorder, right? He said, yes. I said, why then would all the parts of that cell have come together in an organized fashion? Okay, by this time, I'm not kidding. He was literally staring at the floor. He said, well, we don't know that. I said, no worries. How about this? What did that first cell eat? I kid you not. He cut his eyes, looked at me like, are you kidding me? I asked him 3 or 4 more questions. I knew he couldn't answer. And then I switched gears on him, and I said, Dr. Joe, are you familiar at all with the brachial plexus? It's a nerve plexus. It sits right up under your armpit. It's huge. If you've ever seen it, I'll tell you what it reminds me of. Some of you guys will remember this. Remember when you were in elementary school, you used to take yarn, and you'd weave it between your fingers, and somebody'd stick their hand through. You know what I'm talking about? Looks very similar to that. It's big. It's one of the largest nerve plexuses in the body. When I asked him about it, he immediately jerked his head up. He said, oh, yes, I'm familiar with it. I said, so you've actually seen this nerve plexus? He stuck out his chest. He said, I've even done surgery on it. I said, so you're telling me you've personally seen the design in this nerve plexus? He said, yes, I've seen the design. And as soon as that left his lips, he realized what he just admitted to. Because if you got a design, you got to what? A designer. So he immediately crawfished on me. He said, but the human body is full of vestigial organs. Proof of evolution. So I smiled at him. I said, well, you know, Dr. Joe, you've had medical training. I've had medical training. How about we take these cameras into a sterile operating suite and I'll just cut out all of yours? He didn't want to do that. You know why? Because deep down he realizes they do have a function. And yet, here's the thing, folks. Our kids keep getting false story after false story after false story. Why is it a big deal? Turn in your Bible to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. We had one history lesson that some of you guys were young enough for. Now let's look at a different one. This one's going to go back a little further in time. Let me kind of set the stage. You remember the book of Deuteronomy? It's basically a series of sermons that Moses was giving that second generation of Israelites, right? Look at what he says, starting in verse 11 of chapter 8. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments. Okay, remember they're just about to enter the land of milk and honey. Moses is not going to be able to go. So he says, do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, when your herds and your flocks multiply, your silver and your gold are multiplied, all that you have are multiplied, and your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God. He's basically saying, look, when you get there, it's going to be nice. You're going to be affluent. Don't forget God. So as you look at those words, let me ask you, is it possible that we could have forgotten God? Built goodly houses? So then the obvious question is, all right, well, what happened to them? Well, let's fast forward. We hit the book of Joshua. Joshua chapter 1, he's the guy that's going to take him across the river, right? By Joshua chapter 4, here's what's happening. They're building up memorial stones for future generations. Why? Because God wanted them to know, I kept my promise. I told you I was going to give you this land. And he literally just starts rolling out the red carpet. Cities start falling. First one to go down, Jericho. Then Ai. And all of these various tribes move in and they take over their specific area. God kept his promise. He gave them judges. Did they want judges? What did they really want? They wanted a king. God said, you don't want a king. Because if you have a king, here's what's going to happen. Your kids are going to serve the king. He'll take the best of your land. You know what they said? Give us a king. So he did. And if I were to mention them to you this evening, like Saul, does that ring a bell? David? Solomon, you remember? Remember who came after Solomon? It was actually one of Solomon's sons, Rehoboam. And it's under Rehoboam that those 12 tribes actually split into a divided kingdom. We had 12 of them, or 10 of those 12 went north. They formed Israel. They had 19 kings, every single one of which was evil. You can read in your Bible, 1st, 2nd Kings, you can read in Chronicles. I mean, these guys were so bad. Here's what God did. He sent prophets to try to call them back. He sent men like Elijah, Isaiah. And yet, most of you in here, you know their fate. In roughly 722 BC, God said, I'm done with you. And he gave them over to the Assyrians. All right. What about the other two tribes? Remember, Benjamin and Judah made up the nation of Judah. They also had 19 kings, most of which we would call evil. They did have some good guys. Like, for instance, they had a guy named Josiah. Remember him? Who, when he realized that they were immoral, they weren't doing right, they found the book of the law, tore his clothes, he read the law in front of the people. But here's the thing. When you go back and you read your Bible, during this period, what you find out is they didn't tear down the high places. They allowed all kinds of pagan worship. So again, what did God do? He sent men, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, to try to call them back. And yet in 606 BC, they were given over to the Babylonians. Now, you say, okay, Brad, what's the big deal? Why the second history lesson? Take a look. It took 213 years for God's chosen people in his chosen land of Israel to be given over to the Assyrians. It took 349 for Judah. I think the reason why Judah lasted longer, they did have a few good guys in there, right? You look at me and you say, so what? What's the big deal? The question that I want running through your head right this moment is this. Look at those dates and ask yourself, how old is the United States of America? I'll give you a hint. We declared our independence in 1776. We fall quite literally between those numbers. So now the obvious question should be, all right, then what determines the course of a nation? I mean, think about it. You guys could go home tonight. You can turn on your TV. I'm not recommending it because we're in a political election. You don't want to hear all that. But you could. And the news person, they would tell you about, all the things that they think are important, like maybe the economy or the stock market or Social Security or gun control. Here's the interesting thing. If Jesus Christ comes back tomorrow, how many of those things on the screen really matter? None of them. Now I'm really going to make some of you mad. Not even Social Security. You want to know what determines the course of a nation, folks? It is our obedience and our reverence to Almighty God. That's it. See, we've forgotten, what did the proverb writer say? Righteousness exalts a nation. We've completely forgotten that. Sin is a reproach to any people. It's interesting. We say it, we quote it, we preach it, but do we really get? And I say we don't get it because, folks, right now, America, we have more than 50% of our states right now have legalized same-sex marriage. All I've ever known, legalized abortion. We produce about 82% of the world's pornography. We got immorality on TV. And yet the Bible says righteousness exalts a nation. You remember what happened to those areas? Take a look. 2 Kings chapter 17, starting in verse 13. Yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all of his prophets, every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways, keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and by which I sent to you by my servant the prophets. Nevertheless, they would not hear, but they stiffened their necks like the necks of their fathers, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They had atheists back then, didn't they? Look at it. It says, they stiffened their necks like the necks of their fathers who did not believe in the Lord their God. I need you to understand, folks, one of the things that we're reaping from all of this stuff we're talking about is we're reaping an entire generation who basically either isn't sure that there's a God or has absolutely no belief in a God. I get asked the question on a pretty regular basis, Brad, do you really think that we ought to bring prayer back in school? Do you want some denominational person praying in front of your kids? Here's my response to that. While I don't exactly relish the thought of a denominational person praying in front of my kid, at least it would remind every child in that school that there is a supreme being. And that's something we need to remind our kids. You didn't get here by chance. You're not just some cosmic accident. There's a purpose to your life. And folks, once we grasp hold of that, once we realize we were made in the image and likeness of God, that's when we can turn the direction of our country around. Yeah, we got some problems, but we can fix them. Let me leave you with one final verse just to kind of let you understand why I say that. Turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 7. Look with me at verse 14. If my people, who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin and heal their land. That's good news. But let me point out to you. He says, if my people who are called by my name, who's that today? That's Christians. Does he say, if my people who are called by my name will sit in a pew every Sunday morning for an hour? No. He's saying that we got to do something. So let me throw the challenge out to you. We're losing a lot of our kids. You want to fix it? Start doing something about it. Take this book, teach it to your children, your grandchildren, and live the principles inside of it, folks. You are here for a reason. The question is, are you going to pass that reason on to your offspring? Appreciate very, very much y'all's attention. It has been a pleasure being with you for the last couple of weeks.